Okay, welcome back. And I am recording this lecture actually a second time today because the first time I recorded it, for some reason, uh, Zoom kind of crashed as it was downloading the file, and I could not seem to find a way to find capture that file, and so I'm gonna have to do it all over again. Oh well. So gesture, mark making, and expression. And what we're looking at today is kind of like a combined lecture. This is unit one. So for those who've been following me in real time, I'm actually going a little bit backwards because I just finished a bunch of unit two lectures, but I'm going back to finish off unit one. This is the last lecture of unit one that I didn't get around to doing earlier. Every unit has one lecture on some kind of design concept. And usually it's kind of multiple design concepts that all relate to each other. So in this case, one of the design concepts is line, but related to line is mark, like what's the difference between a line and a mark, and mark making. And that also then leads to gesturalness and expressiveness. And this all kind of ties in to the lecture on drawing to a degree and ties into the theme, the making a mark theme that we talked about earlier. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so this lecture kind of is broken up a little bit into two parts. The first three, one, two, three, are all primarily talking about the big kind of philosophical issue of gesturalness and expressiveness. And what does it mean when we say something is expressive? Do we mean it's expressing something in specific, particular? And then starting with four, five, and six, much more, I'm talking about the more nitty-gritty details of like, what is a line, how lines vary, what do we mean by that, and then and what's the difference between a line and a mark and stuff like that. Okay. But in the middle, there's also a couple of digressions where some caveats that I think are pretty important, some assumptions that need to be reconsidered along the way. Okay. And it's just me at the moment, but anyone enters I'm going to go ahead and hide myself. But if anyone um, enters the Zoom, we'll pause for a second to answer some questions. Okay, and then I'm just going to put my little block right over there. Okay, so that covers the main stuff. So is gesture and expression solely a 20th century issue? That's where we will start. Where's mine? There we go. So the beginnings of this lecture have to do with how it ties in to the very first lecture of Unit 1, the art historical lecture, where we're talking about Paleolithic art and Neolithic art. And when we're talking about the Paleolithic art, we are talking primarily about cave paintings and primarily Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet. And in those, they're the the paintings slash drawings slash carvings on the walls of the caves are very, they feel very kind of modern and very today in multiple ways. One, they feel very kind of modern because they seem quite naturalistic. They're the attempt to observe the physiology, the anatomy of a cave lion seems quite specific and accurate. But they are also very loose, very gestural, and that also feels very kind of modern and contemporary. And when they were first discovered, like when Altamira was first discovered, people were amazed at how loose and expressive they were. And and because from their point of view, being loose and expressive was a thing that they had as a culture that, artists were just beginning to like figure out and learn about. And it was kind of like the assumption, I think, that at that time that like art started very kind of stereotypical, very symbolic, very tight, very rigid. And it was only more advanced artists where you started to get a culture of gesturalness and looseness and flow. I think that was in large part just a representation of their bias, of their time, of their place. And if they'd been better aware of the whole full history of art and art history, they would have known that there are many cultures that have kind of like at various times really embraced the process, embraced looseness and gesturalness and defined in multiple ways, and then also various times where those things have been abandoned and then rediscovered. So yeah, it is not just a thing associated with the modern. It's not just a thing that's associated with the primitive. So what do we mean when we say we're being loose and gestural? What do we mean when we say we're being expressive? So here's a thought. My drawing teacher, when I was an undergraduate, she once told me that like, the mark you make is a direct reflection of the action of your body. And there is some truth to that. I think there is some ways that that's not true in that it's quite possible to learn how to make really loose looking expressive marks, but do it in a very controlled and organized way. And it's also possible to make, make marks that look pretty tight, but do it in a way that's pretty fast, quick, loose, and gestural. So a lot of it just has to do with training and practice and what your goals are. But it is definitely true that students in general have a hard time learning to be loose and gestural. Like that, coming out of high school, getting into college, students who are good at drawing tend to be also tight at drawing. And they tend to fear, taking risks and being a little bit, you know, a little bit madcap, a little bit loose because they fear making something wrong, making mistakes. And what do we mean when we say something is expressive, right? Like, are we saying that it's expressing something exact, something literal? Um, or do we just mean that the marks feel like they suggest some kind of emotion? And like, I think these examples here are good examples of how what you take out of them, a lot has to do with your context that you bring to them. Like I think that for someone who doesn't know any of de Kooning's painting or has seen very little of de Kooning's paintings, doesn't know his body of work as a whole, someone would look at that painting and say that the mark making is kind of agitative, it's anxious, it feels um, kind of aggressive, um, a little bit bold, but more kind of like disturbed, right? But knowing the body of work of de Kooning, I I feel like the mark making seems pretty normal, pretty it's just de Kooning and the way he makes marks. It's not particularly aggressive or particularly agitated. However, because I know the full body of of a lot of his paintings, I look at this painting and I see that mark making system as being specifically kind of lyrical, specifically kind of languorous and slow and loose because it's different from the way he normally puts marks down. And so it's in the context of the larger language of how he paints. So your impression of what you think this is expressing is very kind of dependent on whether you know much about that particular artist's body of work. Similarly, like with a painting like this by Frank Auerbach, I think for a person who doesn't know Auerbach's work at all, it feels very aggressive, very bold, very, like rah. Whereas taken in the context of many of Frank Auerbach's portraits, which are oftentimes of the same model again and again and again, this particular painting for me has much more of a feeling of kind of reserve and control and distance that's different from a lot of others of his paintings. But once again, that I think would only be clear to you if you knew lots of his paintings. Okay, so, but before we go any further, because we're going to be eventually talking about marks and lines and mark making, stuff like that, we need to pause for a second and check our assumptions. Number one, I think we need to check our assumption that, let's see, do we have anyone else here? No. Okay, looked like a second there was someone joining us. So one of the assumptions we should check is like that we have this kind of desire to kind of feel like loose and gestural means primitive, and that primitive is generally also the same as prehistoric, or like, put another way, like those cultures in the world that are quote unquote primitive, meaning that they don't have a writing culture, they don't have a and they don't have like industrial culture. That because they're similar in that ways to lots of the prehistoric cultures that we can guess about, right? Because they didn't have writing as well. It's kind of assumed that therefore they're similar to each other. And I don't think that's a correct assumption. That is a mistaken assumption. The people who are living in um, non-literary, like in cultures where they don't have any form of writing in the world today are just as modern, just as contemporary as we are, right? They're living in the modern world. And so it's easy maybe to look at like this painting from Lascaux, and you could look at it and go, oh, it's very loose, it's gestural, it's very kind of primitive. But you could also look at it and say, it's interestingly very similar to this kind of approach, right, in this painting, um, which is from the 13th century in China. And so it helps you to see, wait, maybe it's much more sophisticated than we were thinking. Because this is clearly a very controlled, refined, sophisticated painting. And we could look at the similarities between these and overstate some of the meanings just because Giacometti is after something that is kind of raw and expressive and bold and even like a little bit aggressive doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the makers of this plastered human skull were after. They may have not seen this as being something that was to be intimidating or scary or aggressive or agitated. And we should also, to check another assumption, we should not assume that there is just two extremes, just tight and controlled versus loose and gestural, right? And and even we shouldn't think of it as a continuum, like just a line with one end and the other end. Instead, we should be thinking about it as that there are multiple types of gesturalness, and there are multiple types of being controlled and tight. And so, Diesel, hold on a second. You guys good? Yeah. All right. Sorry for that interruption. So, um, like one of my points is that like these are all loose and done with ink and with brush, but they're quite different from each other in terms of the kind of looseness. Some of the looseness is a little bit more calligraphic, a little bit slower and more fluid, right? Um, some is a little bit more kind of specific, like willing to find like little tiny little irregularities. Um, some some types of loose gestural marks with ink are maybe a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more active. There's a lot of difference between those, and that they are more different from each other than the fact that they share the similarity of being pretty loose. So let's talk some more about marks and lines. And actually, let's before we even start there, let's talk about so lines, as some of you may know from one of my recent lectures. Lines are considered an art element, right? They're generally seven art elements that would be lines, shapes, uh, value, and color. Those four are the ones most strongly associated with two-dimensional art. And then the three others are texture, form, and space, and that makes seven. Texture, form, and space are all art elements that in real form are very real and affect three-dimensional objects, right? So like all three-dimensional objects like sculptures, works of pottery have form and they all occupy space. Many of them have actual textures. But all of those same things also do exist in two-dimensional forms. Like in a two-dimensional form, we have simulated textures where we recreate textures. We have um, simulated form and simulated space. That's what perspective is, right? It's a way of creating the illusion of space in a two-dimensional. So lines, once again, are one of the art elements. But if lines are the art elements, what are marks? Right? And I often say, I like to think of marks as being kind of like if line is like an element, like let's say oxygen, and shapes are like nitrogen, then marks are like subatomic particles, like quarks or something. They're the building blocks that make all the other things. Okay, so here's a list that you can look at it. And I think the main thing that I want you to understand is that there's a lot of similarity between these two lists. The ways that lines can vary are very similar to the way that marks can vary. There are some differences, and we'll talk about what the differences are between lines and marks, but probably more than anything else, I want you to just get the idea that there's a lot of similarity between these two. But if you want to take the time to look at each of the places where there is a difference, you can do that. You can pause the video. So how do I define a mark? A mark is a fundamental unit of two-dimensional art. A mark can be small or large. Um, a mark is, if you think about it, like every two-dimensional work of art begins with a surface, whether that's a piece of paper or it's a rock, right? It's a surface, should be or could be relatively flat, and then you make some kind of impression or mark onto that surface, whether that's using a drawing tool, leaving charcoal on the surface, or with powdered pigment, or with a brush and powder pigment, or with a brush and wet pigment, or by scraping and scratching into the surface, carving lines into the surface. It's all marks. Okay, a mark is any kind of impression or change to a surface made by hand or a tool. Okay, so what is a line? The main thing that's different about a line compared to a mark in general is that lines, the important quality of them is their length, right? That they're going from point A to point B, whether that's in a straight line or a continuing meandering sort of line. That's the thing that makes them a line. Okay. Mathematically, a line can be defined as a path of a point that moves across the surface. So I also want to, right now, while we're talking about it, define two things about different ways that lines create shapes and different ways that lines create value. Um, the different ways that lines create shape, that's going to actually come back. You'll see I'll have a little bit more information on that in the shape lecture if you haven't yet watched the lecture on shape and figure ground. And how lines create value, I might actually go all the way down to the drawing lecture a little bit to show you some thoughts on that. So lines basically can create shapes three main ways, like delineation, which is the simplest way, which is drawing a line around the shape, or shape fill, where it's just like just paint that area a color and it becomes a shape, or um, you know, cut a colored piece of paper into a triangle, put that on top of another colored piece of paper, you now have a shape without even having a line drawn around it. Or implied shapes and implied like grouping to create shapes, which is a very complex thing to talk about, and that will be covered in the lecture on shapes. How do lines create value? Lines can create value through changes of line weight, as we'll see in the lecture and drawing, but I'm going to actually go there to show you a little bit what I mean, or through line and mark repetition, like hatching and cross-hatching. So I'm going to skip over this stuff for a second. Let's go to the drawing lecture, just to make sure that we understand that concept. So line weight, line quality, right? That's how a line can change from thin to thick, right? Sometimes in some drawings, it can be where a lot of lines are all one kind of weight, one kind of thickness, and then they get much thicker in certain places. Or it can be where a line changes very kind of like fluidly in the moment, goes from dark to lighter to thinner, right? Okay. And let's look at, here's a good example. Change of line weight can both be a change in the thinness and thickness of a line, like if you were drawing with a brush and ink, but it can also just be the change in the darkness of the line. Because if you were drawing with a pencil, which, and this, by the way, is a pencil drawing, interestingly enough, we'll talk about that in the drawing lecture. If you're drawing with a pencil or with a charcoal, how hard you press might make the line go from being a very light, faint gray kind of line to a very dark line without changing its thickness very much at all. Right? So those are two things that we mean when we say change of line weight. So besides change of line weight, the other main way that lines can create value can be through repetition of mark, sometimes what we call hatching and cross hatching, but any kind of building up of mark making systems. So like we can see that here. Let's zoom in a little bit, right? You can see how like these dark areas are created by just building up lines upon lines upon lines. Or let's see if we can go to, yeah, to this one. Right. And it's subtle, might not be able to see it, but there are little tiny hatching marks going right along there, right? Little places where just very light hatching to build up tone and to build up value. Okay. So that covers, where were we? This point. Okay, next point. Types of lines. Yeah, lines do vary quite a lot. And the main thing I would say is that for artists, this doesn't matter that much at all. It's mostly a non-issue. When I originally was doing the research for this and I was thinking about different types of lines, and they do vary sometimes. And I was just like looking and I was amazed because what I found was a lot of charts like this and like this, and that's because although categorizing different kinds of lines is really not that important to most working artists, to working engineers and scientists, especially those who are, working with a lot of diagrammatic work, it's really useful because they need to be able to say this line represents a solid brick wall and this line represents a fence or whatever. And this line represents an electric fence. Okay, so one point I want to make here is just that there are lots of different ways, just like we were saying earlier, there are a lot of different ways of being loose and gestural. There are also a lot of different ways of being tight and controlled. And so, you know, don't assume that it means looking exactly one way or another. And getting back, right? Loose and expressiveness does not always look the same. Similarly, fluid and calligraphic marks, right? Fluid and calligraphic, yeah, these two artists here share some similarities, right? But there's a lot of differences as well. We, for both of them, we can say that the lines are very kind of fluid, very calligraphic, but in the Lebrun, they're a little bit faster. They're a little bit more bold. In the Bryce Martin, they're very kind of it's this kind of like slow meander. They're languorous. It's really beautiful. Okay. And so lastly, just in terms of the general topic of expressiveness, I just want to talk about abstract expressionism for a second, talking about de Kooning. And we're going to be talking about this painting, Excavation, multiple times in this class. It will appear on multiple quizzes and tests. And there's a lot to say about it. But for right now, I just want to make sure you're looking at it for a second because I think it's a really interesting painting and it's important painting. And at first, you're not really going to understand much at all about what you see or what you're seeing in it. But I also wanted to show you Woman in Bicycle because it's a much more famous work by de Kooning, or relatively more famous. Excavation is definitely famous to a lot of painters because of its kind of importance in the history of his career as an artist. But they're both fascinating, interesting paintings. And they come out of this time period when American artists were really trying to make painting that was about looseness and about expressiveness, about mark making. In fact, they didn't like the term abstract expressionism. A lot of them preferred the term action painting. Um, Although that I don't think that really did a good job of describing de Kooning's work. It definitely did some others like Pollock's and sometimes Motherwell and definitely like Klein. Okay. Rothenberg comes later. She is like a generation or so later, but definitely her way of painting is very much comes out of the language of abstract expressionism. But I think it's also interesting to see the differences between the way they make marks and the way they think about marks relating to line. There's kind of like a her mark making system is very kind of like small and kind of blurry and kind of agitated. Um, I really like it, but it has its own specific kind of feel. And so continuing to talk about abstract expressionism, like I said, a lot of the artists referred to it as action painting. And yeah, I think you can really get that idea out of a painting like this, where it really seems to be making a claim of this is just one really big, bold action made by the artist, even though actually there's lots of passages that make it clear this was very labored, that there was multiple attempts, multiple back and forths between the negative space and the positive marks. There was multiple kind of like ways of working and reworking it until it was right. But it has kind of like the feel of something that was done in just one session. And and it's a nice painting. I like this painting a lot. But I also really like this painting. And this painting is almost like a parody of the previous painting or a parody of the goals, the ambitions of abstract expressions, where Lichtenstein, in a period that followed just about a decade later, is kind of arguing for um, arguing for the fact that it's all a fiction, right? That here he's making a painting of big, bold brushstrokes, but they are not big. They're not actually painted as big, bold brushstrokes. Instead, they're painted very tightly and controlled with a thin little brush, making, all the little tiny shapes that make up that big, bold brushstroke. Essentially, he's making a version of a brushstroke as if it would existed in like a pulp magazine, like a comic book. And similarly, we see another way of with contemporary artists like Glenn Brown, where he is kind of arguing against the cult of expressiveness. Because what he's doing is he's mimicking the painting style of Frank Auerbach. He's almost like he's hyper realizing it. He's making it extra loose, extra gushy, right? Like making the paint really feel very kind of yeah, super built up. But in fact, this painting is pretty built up. It sticks, a good almost half an inch off the surface in places. This painting is completely flat. Um, all of this work that looks like brushstrokes that are really built up, it's not brushstrokes really built up. It's done with a tiny little brush to reproduce and to mimic the look of those brushstrokes being really built up, which is kind of an interesting idea to pursue. And I think that's the end of the lecture. Okay, and yep, no one had joined me anywhere through, so I'm going to stop the share and we'll end it right there. Thanks.